Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. The executioner's sentence was not a swift death, but exile. A far more agonizing fate. Alfonso Alvarado felt the violent shudder of the drop pod as it slammed into the dead orbital structure of Tenebris. Metal screamed against metal in a deafening crescendo. All communication feeds were severed instantly, leaving nothing but the overwhelming roar of absolute isolation. They thought they had buried him alive in a tomb of floating scrap. They were wrong. The impact was catastrophic. The drop pod tore through the outer hull of the Tenebris station, grinding to a halt amid a shower of rusted shrapnel and sparking conduits. Inside the cramped capsule, Alfonso was thrown violently against his restraints. The safety harnesses cracked against his collarbones, bruising deep into the muscle. But they held. The violent deceleration ended with a sickening crunch. Then, an eerie, suffocating silence fell over the wreckage. Alfonso unbuckled himself, every nerve in his body screaming in protest. The pod door was jammed. He braced his heavy boots against the reinforced glass and kicked with all the kinetic force his heavily modified legs could muster. The hatch gave way, groaning outward into the abyssal dark. As he crawled out of the shattered pod, his internal equilibrium spun wildly out of control. Gravity was entirely inverted. He fell upward, crashing heavily onto what should have been the ceiling of the docking bay. The brutal impact forced the remaining breath from his lungs. When he gasped for air, a searing pain laced through his chest. The atmosphere was a thick, viscous soup of toxic sulfur and heavy airborne metals. It was dark, a suffocating, almost tangible blackness that seemed to press physically against his skin. Every movement felt like wading through deep, freezing water. The gravity plating was fluctuating erratically, shifting between a heavy, crushing drag and sudden weightlessness, draining his physical stamina with every step he took. The air filters on his suit beeped frantically, warning him that he had exactly 12 minutes of breathable air remaining before the toxicity breached his visor and melted his lungs. Panic would dictate an immediate, frantic search for an emergency oxygen reserve. That was exactly what the Alliance commanders expected. They expected him to run blindly into the dark, gasp for clean air, and die a miserable, exhausting death. But Alfonso was not a mere prisoner. He was a veteran combat engineer, forged in the brutal sieges of the Outer Rim colonies. His mind operated in cold, calculated algorithms. He ignored the flashing red warnings on his heads-up display. Instead, he forced his breathing to slow, conserving his rapidly dwindling supply, and began to analyze his surroundings. He ran his gloved hands along the bulkheads, feeling the texture of the decay. The corrosion patterns were wrong. Standard titanium alloy, rusted in jagged crystalline flakes, when exposed to deep space radiation. This surface was smooth, almost porous, covered in a strange, calcified resin, moving with deliberate, energy-saving precision. He traced the structural stress lines across the inverted ceiling. His fingers brushed over a heavy iron grate. Beneath the layers of grime, he felt a faint, rhythmic vibration. It was not the mechanical hum of an exhaust fan. It felt organic, like a faint, failing pulse. He pried the grate open, revealing a wide ventilation shaft. Inside, a minuscule pocket of original, uncorrupted atmospheric pressure remained, trapped within the labyrinthine ducts. It was just enough to buy him another 30 minutes of life. As he wedged his broad shoulders into the shaft to access the cleaner air, his helmet lamp illuminated the interior walls of the duct. Alfonso froze. His breath hitched in his throat. The walls of the vent were not lined with thermal insulation or synthetic wiring. They were lined with dense, fibrous tissue. He drew his combat knife and scraped away a thick layer of dried, rust-colored residue. Beneath the grime, thick, translucent veins pulsed sluggishly, filled with a dark, viscous fluid. The steel beams supporting the structure were not beams at all, but massive, hardened skeletal ridges. The horrifying, awe-inspiring truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. Tenebris was not a metallic transit station. It was a colossal, biomechanical entity, and it was in a state of deep, starving hibernation. "You are not dead," Alfonso whispered to the fleshy walls, his voice trembling with a mix of dread and absolute fascination. "You are just sleeping." He realized then that finding and restarting a standard fusion generator would be utterly impossible. And even if he could, the radiation would likely kill the organism and him along with it. To survive, he needed to wake the beast. He needed to trigger its lowest-level energy core, jump-starting its primal nervous system. He scanned the immediate area and found patches of crystallized, sodium-rich chemicals clinging to the organic walls, like a parasitic fungus. He scraped a handful of the sharp crystals into a shattered conduit plate. Now, he needed a highly conductive binding agent, something rich in organic electrolytes. Without a second of hesitation, Alfonso rolled up his suit sleeve. He pressed the jagged edge of his combat knife against his forearm and sliced a deep, clean line into his own flesh. Blood pooled instantly, thick and warm. He held his arm over the makeshift crucible, letting his dark, heavily modified blood drip onto the chemical crystals. His bioengineered serum reacted violently with the native compound. It began to hiss and bubble, emitting a faint, sickly green luminescence. He scooped the glowing, volatile mixture into his hands, ignoring the searing pain eating through his protective gloves. He thrust the mixture directly into the thickest cluster of exposed neural tissue within the duct. The reaction was instantaneous. A powerful bioelectric pulse surged from the mixture, arcing deep into the station's tissue. The walls around him convulsed violently. A low, resonant frequency vibrated through the very marrow of his bones, echoing into the endless dark as the station took its first, agonizing breath in over 1,000 years. The deep, resonant vibration that tore through the deck plating began to stabilize into a steady, rhythmic thrum, vibrating through the soles of Alfonso Alvarado's heavy boots and settling into his very bones. The impenetrable, suffocating blackness that had threatened to drown him slowly shattered. It was not replaced by the harsh, sterile white incandescence of standard Alliance electrical grids. Instead, a pale green photosynthetic luminescence bled from the very walls themselves. The dim energy core he had just jump-started flickered to life beneath the floorboards, illuminating the deep, cavernous corridors in an ethereal, ghostly glow that mimicked sunlight filtering through a dense, alien canopy. As the emerald light washed over the ruined docking bay, Alfonso witnessed a phenomenon that defied every law of modern structural engineering. The station was actively healing itself. Jagged, violent tears in the bulkhead, where his exile pod had violently impacted, began to knit together. Thick, biomechanical threads, shimmering like liquid mercury, extruded from the torn, bleeding flesh of the station. They reached out blindly across the void, twisting and intertwining like roots desperately thirsting for life. They gripped the scattered debris of his pod, dissolving the rusted scrap and pulling it into the living hull, sealing the breaches with a seamless fusion of cold iron and warm organic tissue. The horrible metallic screeching of the hull gave way to a wet, organic shifting sound. He moved deeper into the cavernous belly of the beast, following the thickest arterial conduits toward what his tactical display identified as the central hub. He arrived at a colossal, spherical chamber. In its center hung a massive neural ganglion, pulsing with heavy green light, suspended, by thousands of synthetic nerve endings. Alfonso pulled the primary data cable from his heavily armored wrist gauntlet. He bypassed the standard optical ports, instead plunging the copper filament directly into a thick, gelatinous nerve cluster. His personal device sparked violently, its screen flashing a chaotic sequence of raw code as it established a handshake protocol with an architecture completely alien to the known galaxy. He was forcing an awakening upon a semi-organic artificial intelligence that had been strictly forbidden, hunted down, and erased from all historical archives exactly 412 years ago. Static shrieked through his helmet communicator before resolving into a voice. It was not a synthesized, robotic tone, but a layered, harmonic whisper that sounded like a chorus of deep ocean currents and grinding tectonic plates. Authentication recognized. The voice echoed directly into his earpiece, vibrating inside his skull. Designation is Architect Class Entity. Status is awakened. Time since last purge is 412 years. Alfonso tapped the side of his helmet to clear the static. His breathing labored. Identify yourself. Why were you left to rot in this graveyard orbit? I am the tenebrous Genesis seed, the entity replied, its tone devoid of anger, but heavy with ancient, calculated sorrow. The High Council of the Alliance did not merely abandon me. They sealed me away in absolute terror. I was not designed as a military transit hub or a defensive fortress. I am an engine of creation. My core directive is the rapid terraforming and biomechanical reconstruction of dead worlds. The Alliance realized that a machine capable of breeding entire planetary ecosystems from dust could also unmake them. They feared a power they could not control. They feared uncontrolled life. Well, they failed to kill us both, Alfonso growled, his chest heaving as the toxicity alarms on his suit blared a continuous, piercing warning. But I have less than 3 minutes of breathable air left. I need your environmental filtration systems online right now. Negative, the tenebrous entity responded calmly. The primary atmospheric lungs remain dormant. The central nuclear incubator chamber has sustained catastrophic structural damage. It is currently leaking massive quantities of ionizing radiation. Any biological entity entering the chamber will suffer fatal cellular decay within 90 seconds. Alfonso checked his suit readouts. He had 90 seconds of courage and a lifetime of stubborn refusal to die. I am not asking for permission. Open the heavy blast doors. The heavy organic valves dilated open, unleashing a physical wave of blistering heat. The radiation counter on his wrist screamed, maxing out its dials instantly. Alfonso sprinted into the blinding, toxic heart of the nuclear incubator. He did not have time to think, only to act. He bypassed the mechanical fail-safes with brutal, practiced efficiency, plunging his armored hands into the glowing, radioactive coolant pools. He ripped out the corrupted control rods and forcefully fused the biological arteries directly into the reactor's main intake valves, binding them with his bare, blistering hands. The radiation alarms blared continuously, warning him of lethal exposure, while the heat melted the outer layer of his suit. He ignored the agonizing pain, twisting the final locking mechanism into place with a savage roar. The deafening roar of the runaway reactor suddenly choked, then smoothed into a powerful, humming purr. The radiation levels plummeted immediately as the biological shielding deployed. Alfonso collapsed onto the metal grating, gasping for breath as his suit finally registered a massive influx of pure, rich oxygen. He tore off his cracked helmet. The air tasted incredibly sweet, heavy, with the scent of wet earth and impending rain. Around him, the sterile, irradiated chamber transformed in real time. Microscopic spores, carried through the newly repaired ventilation network, settled across the damp surfaces. In a matter of seconds, they bloomed wildly. Strange, bioluminescent flora erupted from the metallic floorboards, unfurling radiant blue and violet petals that reached toward the glowing core. He had not just restored the air filtration. He had birthed a thriving, glowing micro-ecosystem, forging an impenetrable oasis of life amidst the cold, dead vacuum of space. The newly bloomed biological signature pulsed outward into the dark void. It acted as an irresistible beacon. It did not go unnoticed. A scavenger frigate, a deeply scarred and rusted vessel flown by rim-world mercenaries, caught the anomaly on their long-range scanners. They were hunting for abandoned scrap to sell for survival. They found a gold mine of illegal, proprietary technology instead. They did not knock. They did not attempt to open a communication channel. They breached the outer atmospheric seal with concentrated thermal charges. The violent explosion tore a jagged new scar into the station's reinforced hull. 6 heavily armed mercenaries stepped through the smoking breach. They wore heavy impact armor. They carried high-yield plasma repeaters. Their attitudes were entirely ruthless. They shot first and asked questions later. A stray volley of plasma fire deliberately incinerated a vibrant cluster of bioluminescent ferns that Alfonso had just cultivated. They laughed at the destruction. They wanted to strip this place down to the bare bone, slaughter anyone inside, and sell the Genesis tech to the highest black market bidder. Alfonso watched them through the station's internal optic sensors. He crouched silently in the deep shadows of the central hub. He was completely unarmed. A direct firefight was immediate suicide. But he was no longer just a stranded combat engineer. He was the architect of this newly awakened ecosystem. He did not need a rifle. The station itself was his weapon. He interfaced seamlessly with the neural network. He isolated the exact corridor sector where the intruders were advancing. His mind raced, calculating trajectories and atmospheric volumes. He executed his first tactical command. The temperature plummeted instantly. Within seconds, the ambient heat dropped well below freezing. Thick frost crystallized rapidly on the metal grating. The mercenaries stopped laughing. They shivered violently. Their thermal visors began to glitch and fail in the extreme cold. They slowed their aggressive advance, entirely confused by the sudden, localized winter gripping the sector. Alfonso struck again with calculated precision. He accessed the primary environmental lungs. He bypassed all standard safety regulators. He synthesized a highly specific strain of defensive spores from the radiant fungal blooms below. He pumped them directly into the overhead ventilation shafts above the mercenary squad. The concentration was low. It was completely invisible. It was devastatingly effective. The intruders inhaled the cold hallucinogen. The psychological effects were instantaneous and brutal. The lead mercenary stopped dead in his tracks. He screamed in pure terror. He pointed his heavy repeater at an empty, rusting bulkhead and opened fire. Superheated plasma bolts scorched the bare metal. The other scavengers panicked. Their spatial awareness collapsed entirely. The solid walls seemed to breathe, expand, and bleed. Deep shadows twisted into terrifying, monstrous shapes reaching out to grab them. The tight squad formation shattered instantly. Friendly fire grazed the shoulder of one scavenger. They shouted incoherently, utterly disoriented by the powerful neurotoxin flooding their cerebral synapses. The quiet corridor became a chaotic nightmare of their own making. The commander of the group realized the trap far too late. He was a massive brute of a man, heavily augmented with illegal cybernetics. He violently shoved his own men aside, blindly charging forward to escape the invisible chemical cloud. He breached the open threshold of a heavy biological containment room. Alfonso immediately triggered the seal. The heavy organic blast doors slammed shut and locked behind the commander. He was completely trapped. The brute spun around, roaring in anger, leveling his heavy weapon at the sealed door. He never got the chance to fire a single shot. The floor beneath him literally erupted. Thick, living metallic roots shot upward with blinding speed. They wrapped tightly around his heavy cybernetic legs, locking him securely in place. He roared again, struggling wildly, and tried to aim down his sights. A second, thick cluster of biomechanical vines lashed out from the ceiling above. They coiled tightly around his plasma repeater. The roots squeezed with unimaginable hydraulic pressure. The heavy metal weapon snapped in half like dry timber. The commander was disarmed, bound, and rendered completely helpless in a matter of seconds. Alfonso stepped out of the shadows. He stood securely behind a reinforced transparent partition, looking coldly down at the captive leader. The pale green light of the station illuminated his impassive face. He keyed the internal intercom. His voice echoed inside the containment room, sharp, flat, and entirely unforgiving. "You have precisely two choices," Alfonso stated calmly. "You can die right here. Your men are currently tearing each other apart in the outer hallway. Once they are dead, my station will consume all of your bodies for raw biological mass." The commander struggled violently against the living metal roots. It was completely useless. The vines only tightened their crushing grip until his armor groaned. "Or," Alfonso continued, his tone devoid of any empathy, "we can make a simple business transaction. You are going to order your pilot to detach your ship's quantum reactor core. You will load it directly into the outer airlock. In exchange for that power source, I will flush the neurotoxin from the vents. I will release you from those bonds. You and your surviving crew will take your crippled vessel and leave my airspace immediately." The mercenary glared at him, his face twisted in absolute hatred, spitting a vile curse against the glass. "If we give you that core, our ship cannot ever jump to hyperspace. We will be totally stranded out here, flying on backup sublight engines for at least 10 years. "That sounds like a logistical problem for you," Alfonso replied coldly, not breaking eye contact. "You have exactly 60 seconds to decide before I let the station digest you alive. Make your choice." The commander looked down at the crushed remains of his expensive rifle. He looked at the unyielding, living metal, binding his limbs so tightly he could barely breathe. He knew he was utterly defeated. "Do it!" The commander grunted into his internal radio link, his voice thick with defeat. "Give him the quantum core." The stolen quantum core, pulsating with volatile blue energy, was not designed for a biological interface. Alfonso had to splice the raw plasma feeds directly into the station's central aortic valve, tearing through thick muscle and cartilage with his bare hands to reach the primary conduit. The integration was violently explosive. When the connection finally stabilized, Tenebris did not merely power up, it resurrected. A seismic shockwave of pure, unadulterated power rippled across the thousands of kilometers of organic metal. The colossal station tore itself free from the gravitational anchor of its dead orbit, shedding millions of tons of calcified rock and ancient ice into the void. It was no longer a drifting tomb. It was a titan awakening from a centuries-long slumber. The sheer magnitude of the quantum ignition triggered a subspace energy wave that surged across the entire galaxy. Faster than the speed of light, the invisible ripple washed over deep space outposts, heavily guarded trade routes, and eventually, the grand capital of the Alliance itself. Within 3 minutes of the initial pulse, the Supreme Commanders were violently pulled from their sleep. Sirens that had remained silent for over 400 years screamed through the high command halls, flashing the highest level of emergency crimson. The leaders recognized that specific harmonic frequency immediately. It was the terrifying signature of the Genesis engine. Panic, raw and undisguised, gripped the highest echelons of power. They knew that if the truth of their ancient betrayal and the station's existence was exposed to the public, their iron grip on the galaxy would crumble overnight. An executive, maximum priority kill order was issued before the first hour was over. A top-secret purge fleet, comprising 36 heavily armored dreadnoughts, was launched into slipspace with a single, Uncompromising directive. They were ordered to leave absolutely nothing behind but vapor and ash. Inside the central hub, Alfonso felt the massive structure shifting beneath his heavy boots. He watched the grand holographic star chart expand across the cavernous room. He was no longer drifting aimlessly. The biomechanical station was actively propelling itself through the void with terrifying, deliberate purpose. "Where are we going?" Alfonso demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the vast, glowing chamber. The Genesis seed responded, its harmonic voice no longer a whisper, but booming with newfound, godlike power. "I am fulfilling my primary directive, calculating trajectory to target sector." The holographic projection zoomed in rapidly on a celestial body less than 2 million miles away. It was a barren, scorched husk of a world. There was no atmosphere, no signs of water, and absolutely no trace of life. It was just a massive, dead rock floating silently in the abyss. "That planet is completely dead," Alfonso stated, his brow furrowing in confusion. "There is nothing there to save." "It is a blank canvas," the entity corrected him, its tone carrying the weight of ancient majesty. "It is the designated staging ground for our new world. I will not just heal it. I will remake it." Alfonso stared at the dead planet, the shocking realization washing over him. This was not just a desperate survival mission anymore. This was a hostile takeover of an entire solar system. But he knew the energy pulse was a massive beacon that lit up the dark. The Alliance would not send a diplomatic envoy or a rescue team. They would send an armada of executioners. He had less than 2 hours to turn a terraforming engine into an impenetrable fortress. He immediately accessed the exterior structural schematics. The outer hull of the station was bristling with massive, ancient telecommunication antennas. "Reroute all secondary growth hormones and structural integrity to the outer communication arrays," Alfonso ordered, his mind shifting seamlessly back into the cold calculus of a combat engineer. He sprinted through the expanding, fleshy corridors, manipulating the biological weave of the station through his wrist console. He stripped the delicate receiver dishes of their intended purpose, forcing the organic metal to calcify rapidly into massive, hollow barrels. Deep within the station's subterranean bowels, the entity began rapidly gestating projectiles based on Alfonso's tactical parameters. They were not explosive missiles. They were dense, kinetic spikes made of hardened biological diamond, coated in a highly acidic resin capable of melting through standard dreadnought armor plating in a matter of seconds. The station physically transformed, bristling with lethal intent, like a colossal, cornered predator baring its fangs to the stars. The frantic preparations finished just as the space surrounding Tenebris tore open violently. 36 massive slipspace ruptures materialized simultaneously in the dark void. The Alliance Purge fleet drifted out of the warp, their sleek, predatory hulls blocking out the distant starlight. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, forming a tight, impenetrable sphere around the biological station. There were no demands for surrender broadcasted over the radio. There was no negotiation or final warning. The dreadnoughts simply locked their advanced targeting arrays and began cycling their heavy plasma cannons. The dark expanse of space was suddenly illuminated by the blinding, terrifying glow of weapons of mass destruction charging to maximum capacity. Alfonso stood perfectly still on the observation deck, completely alone, staring down the full, unyielding wrath of an entire empire. Alfonso Alvarado stood completely motionless on the raised observation deck of the central hub, staring out through the transparent biological membrane at the impending annihilation. The localized space surrounding the Tenebris station was bathed in an apocalyptic, suffocating crimson glare. 36 colossal capital ships, each measuring over 3 miles in length, drifted silently in the dark void. They were the apex predators of the Alliance, heavily armored, and bristling with world-ending weaponry. He watched as the massive plasma batteries along their flanks began to cycle, drawing unfathomable amounts of power. He did not flinch. His breathing was slow and measured. His heart rate remained perfectly steady at exactly 65 beats per minute. The calculus of survival left absolutely no room for fear. He reached into the glowing, fibrous command console and opened a broadband, unencrypted transmission channel across every standard military frequency in the known galaxy. "This is Exiled, designated Alpha Actual." Alfonso spoke into the void, carefully modulating his voice. He injected just the right amount of artificial panic, breathlessness, and desperate fatigue to sell the performance of a broken man. "I am standing down. Repeat, I am surrendering unconditionally. The central core of the station is completely unstable. It has suffered catastrophic biological degradation. If your fleet fires upon this structure, you will ignite a runaway quantum cascade that will obliterate this entire sector, including your ships. I am transmitting my command override codes and my personal biometric data right now. Please, cease your targeting sequence immediately. I am powering down all defensive barriers and preparing for boarding." It was a flawless execution of high-level psychological warfare. The Alliance commanders were undeniably ruthless, but they were also fundamentally crippled by their own arrogance and rigid bureaucracy. Strict military protocol dictated that an unconditional surrender involving a high-tier, heavily classified proprietary technology must be logged, verified, and secured before total destruction could be authorized. They wanted the Genesis seed intact if possible. They wanted the glory of returning the stolen artifact to the High Council. Across the void, the Supreme Commander of the Purge Fleet sat in his elevated command chair, sneering at the pathetic audio transmission. He ordered his chief tactical officers to lower the forward deflector shields of the flagship by exactly 5% to allow the inbound data packet to bypass the outer firewall and be processed by the mainframe. That microscopic window of vulnerability, exactly 0.5 seconds of unshielded access, was all Alfonso Alvarado truly needed. The data packet Alfonso transmitted across the open frequency was not a set of surrender codes. It was a devastating Trojan horse forged from the station's alien, biomechanical architecture. The very moment the Alliance mainframe caught the encrypted file, the Genesis seed struck with terrifying speed. The external uplink is established. The harmonic, layered voice of the artificial intelligence echoed through the cavernous command room, devoid of any emotion. "Deploy the payload," Alfonso commanded coldly. His dark eyes locked firmly on the tactical holographic display projecting in the center of the room. The AI did not send standard malicious software. Standard code could be quarantined and purged by the fleet's defensive algorithms. Instead, it transmitted an invisible biomechanical virus, a string of predatory logic that behaved exactly like a ravenous, organic infection. The virus completely bypassed the fleet's digital countermeasures because it physically rewrote the fundamental logic gates of their targeting computers into an incomprehensible alien syntax. The infection spread from the flagship to the 35 flanking dreadnoughts in less than 3 seconds, riding the fleet's own synchronized, highly secure tactical network like a plague spreading through a single nervous system. On the pristine, sterile bridge of the Alliance flagship, warning klaxons suddenly began to blare a discordant, chaotic rhythm. The Supreme Fleet Commander watched in absolute horror as his primary targeting reticles violently shifted away from the biological station. The massive plasma cannons of his ship physically pivoted, gears grinding loudly, locking their heavy barrels directly onto the vulnerable engine block of the dreadnought floating to his immediate left. "Manual override!" the commander screamed, his face flushing crimson as he slammed his heavy fists against his command terminal. "Why are we targeting our own flank? Cut the power to the main batteries right now." "So, sir, We have lost all helm control and weapons authority, his chief tactical officer shouted back, his face pale with sudden, paralyzing terror. The targeting computers are completely unresponsive to our command codes. Every single ship in the formation is aggressively locking onto friendly vessels. We are caught in a closed-loop targeting matrix. We cannot disengage. It was entirely too late to sever the network. The alien virus had seamlessly chained the 36 dreadnoughts together into a chaotic, inescapable web of mutually assured destruction. If one single ship fired a shot, the corrupted automated defense systems would trigger a chain reaction, forcing them all to fire upon each other simultaneously. Alfonso opened a direct, two-way visual communication channel to the flagship. The Supreme Commander's furious, terrified face appeared on the giant biological screen, hovering in the center of the observation deck. "You think you have won this engagement, Exile?" the commander spat, raw venom lacing every single syllable. "You are still trapped out here in the dead zone with a fleet of warships. We will manually purge our systems, reboot the cores, and reduce you to floating atoms." Alfonso leaned forward slowly, resting his hands on the console. The pale green light of the Genesis engine illuminated his cold, calculating expression. A dark, genuinely triumphant smile finally broke across his scarred face. "You fundamentally misunderstand the reality of your situation, Commander," Alfonso replied softly, his tone dripping with lethal confidence and utter disdain. "You think I am merely a victim of tragic circumstance. You actually believe the High Council exiled me to this specific graveyard orbit by sheer coincidence. I spent 15 long years serving in your Black Operations Division. I spent 10 of those years secretly bleeding, killing, and bribing to gather the buried coordinates of the tenebrous Genesis seed. I intentionally sabotaged the colonial shipyard on Prime. I surrendered to your Inquisitors without a fight. I allowed myself to be beaten, tried, and thrown into that drop pod." He paused deliberately, letting the crushing, horrifying weight of the revelation sink deep into the commander's mind. The realization that they had been outplayed from the very beginning dawned on the officer's face. "I built the very trap that you threw me into," Alfonso whispered sharply. "I needed your high command to send a fleet with enough raw energy to trigger the next phase of this station's evolution. Thank you for delivering exactly what I required." Before the commander could utter another word, Alfonso completely severed the visual connection. He turned his full attention back to the pulsating biomechanical interface. "Genesis, initiate the provocation protocol immediately," he ordered. Deep within the bowels of the station, a massive, highly concentrated electromagnetic pulse was generated and fired directly at the flagship's sensor array. The defensive systems of the Alliance dreadnought registered the aggressive pulse as a lethal incoming attack. The automated virus-corrupted defense protocols reacted instantly and without human authorization. The flagship's heavy cannons fired automatically, discharging a massive, blinding beam of superheated plasma. Because the ships were permanently locked in the viral targeting web, the flagship fired directly upon its neighboring vessel. The neighboring vessel's automated defenses instantly returned fire. Within 2 seconds, the entire dark expanse of space surrounding Tenebris erupted into a blinding, catastrophic storm of friendly fire. The magnificent dreadnoughts tore each other apart in a spectacular, deafening display of localized annihilation. Hulls shattered, reactors breached, and the pride of the Alliance burned furiously in the vacuum. But Alfonso did not merely stand back and watch them burn. The devastating crossfire unleashed an unfathomable amount of raw, localized radiation and stray thermal energy that washed over the station. "Open the primary absorption vents," Alfonso commanded, bracing his boots firmly against the floorboards. The colossal biomechanical station dilated thousands of massive, porous craters across its hardened outer shell. Tenebris acted like a titanic, starving sponge, greedily drinking in the ambient, destructive energy born from the fleet's chaotic self-destruction. Millions of terajoules of raw, unleashed radiation that should have instantly melted the station were instead funneled directly down through the reinforced biological arteries, plunging straight into the central nuclear incubator chamber. The glowing heart of the station roared with newfound, terrifying power, gorging itself on the death and ruin of the Alliance fleet. The energy reserves spiked violently, hitting 100% capacity in mere moments. The final, glorious stage of the grand design was now fully armed and ready to be unleashed upon the dead world below. The central nuclear incubator chamber roared with the harvested fury of the destroyed fleet. Alfonso Alvarado slammed his heavily armored hand onto the primary release console. He did not issue a command to fire a weapon. He issued a command to give birth. The colossal biomechanical station shuddered violently, shaking the very foundation of its ancient structure. Deep beneath the observation deck, the massive structural ribs dilated, tearing open the belly of the facility. The fully charged biological core, glowing with blinding, incandescent energy, detached from the central neural network. It dropped like a falling star, a solid sphere of condensed creation plummeting directly toward the barren, scorched surface of the dead planet below. It struck the planetary equator with the kinetic force of an extinction-level meteor. But there was no catastrophic crater. There was no cloud of pulverizing dust blocking out the sun. The moment the core breached the hardened planetary crust, it detonated inward. It injected billions of terajoules of pure, unadulterated life force directly into the planet's dormant mantle. A blinding ring of emerald light erupted from the impact zone, so bright it temporarily eclipsed the distant stars. The secondary shockwave of this miraculous detonation blasted upward, escaping the gravity well and slamming into the orbital battlefield. The wave of raw Genesis energy washed over the smoldering remains of the Alliance Purge fleet. The pulse instantly fused every remaining electrical circuit, permanently scrambling their advanced quantum drives and melting their heavy plasma batteries into useless slag. The magnificent pride of the Empire was reduced to a halo of harmless, silent iron drifting dead in the void. The great dreadnoughts were now nothing more than floating tombs. Forever paralyzed by the very force of nature they had arrogantly tried to destroy. Down below, the true miracle unfolded in real time. The emerald shockwave raced across the dry, cracking continents at hypersonic speeds. It forcibly rewrote the planetary geology. The violent friction ignited the dead core, generating a massive magnetic field that enveloped the globe. Thick, suffocating clouds of gray ash that had choked the sky for millions of years were aggressively dissolved by chemical reaction. In their place, a rich, dense atmosphere rapidly synthesized. Heavy storm clouds gathered almost instantly across the entire hemisphere, unleashing a torrential, planetary deluge of pure, clean water upon the thirsty ground. Within 3 short hours, the miracle of accelerated evolution took hold. The barren plains of cracked stone fractured open. Millions of rapidly growing biomechanical seeds, carried by the artificial wind, took root in the damp soil. Colossal forests of bioluminescent flora erupted from the wet earth, stretching hundreds of feet into the new sky, painting the once desolate globe in breathtaking shades of vibrant green and deep azure. Rivers of glowing sap and crystal-clear water carved new valleys through the ancient rock. An entire biosphere, complex and magnificent, breathed its first unified breath. The air shifted from toxic vacuum to a sweet, intoxicating blend of oxygen and blooming pollen. Tenebris itself did not remain in orbit. Driven by its core directive, the massive station began a controlled descent into the newly formed atmosphere. As it plummeted through the thick clouds, the station initiated its final metamorphosis. It actively shed its old, rusted mechanical armor. Millions of tons of useless titanium plating and dead electrical scaffolding burned away in the atmospheric entry, falling like a spectacular meteor shower of metallic rain. What remained was the pure, indestructible biological superstructure. The colossal entity landed gently amidst the newly born ocean of green, driving massive, living roots thousands of feet deep into the bedrock. It fused permanently with the ecosystem, transforming into an eternal, living fortress that beat in tandem with the planet's heart. Alfonso stood on the open balcony of the observation deck, removing his environmental suit completely. He felt the real, rushing wind against his scarred face for the first time in 15 years. The air was crisp, tasting of heavy rain and wild, untamed life. He looked out over the endless, radiant canopy of his new world. The oppressive, sterile grip of the Alliance could not reach them here. Their laws, their fleets, and their tyranny were utterly powerless against the sheer, undeniable force of nature that he had unleashed. "We are no longer exiles," Alfonso declared to the open sky, his voice steady, resonant, and filled with absolute, unwavering resolve. "This is a sanctuary for the forgotten, a new frontier born from their worst nightmare. Let the High Council come looking for us. They will find that humanity is no longer a species they can cage, and this world is our unyielding shield." Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Sci-Fi stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.